Vamos ver então aqui esta merda, perceber porque é que Portugal foi neutro na Segunda Guerra Mundial. Eu acho que a explicação é que só tínhamos era que ser neutros, que somos demasiado pequenos para nos metermos em lutas de gigantes, não é? Vamos lá.
During each World War, a handful of countries throughout Europe decided that it would be best if they remained neutral and non-belligerent, staying out of the fighting, and therefore saving their...
Oh caralho. Toda a gente desta live.
Está a fazer mal a minha
Tudo
companhia. Estou a sentir, é assim mesmo.
Esta merda, um gajo chega aqui, nights em cima da mesa.
Yeah,
citizens...
é para às vezes que estás com música aos berros, mano. Estou a ver vídeos, tenho bué de vídeos para ver, tipo na cena da lista do Ver Mais Tarde, estás a ver? E
porque
pronto,
Portugal era neutro
na Segunda Guerra Mundial. Estou a ver vídeos tipo, que eu acho interessantes, pá, e
cena.
tipo, claro que eu sei que não vou ter números a ver estes vídeos, mas que estou aqui tipo, como se estivesse sozinho, mas em live, estás a ver? A ver vídeos interessantes, por exemplo, estive a ver o vídeo da Tableron, como é que o gajo criou a Tableron. Curto bem ver esses vídeos de como é que a malta cria negócios, estás a ver? Como é que foi, tipo as grandes empresas e grandes negócios, tipo uma Coca-Cola, cenas assim, como é que foi para chegar onde estamos agora, estás a ver? Okay. Acho isso muito fixe, mas gosto bem de ver esses vídeos.
From inevitable doom and death on the battlefield. Neutral nations are ones that not only stay out of the military conflict, but also show no bias toward one side of the war or the other.
Menino dos xaropes.
A non-belligerent nation does not fight the battles directly, but may support one side or specific belligerent nations nonetheless. The difference is often minimal and debated as to whether some nations are neutral or non-belligerent, such as in the case of Portugal during the Second World War. Officially, Portugal was neutral during World War II, although some debate whether they were actually non-belligerent due to a previously formed alliance with Britain. Ironically though, at some points during the conflict, Portugal actually showed favor to Germany, which proved that they were not, in fact, biased to one side or the other. But this also showed that Portugal had relationships with multiple belligerent countries, which then begs the question, why was Portugal neutral? First, let's take a look at the alliance between Portugal and Britain. The Treaty of Windsor was a friendship pact and peace treaty signed between John I of Portugal and Richard II of England back in 1387. This meant that for nearly 600 years, the Portuguese and the Brits had been allies, and it didn't make much sense for that to change in response to the war. It did have an impact though. For one matter, it played a role in Portugal's decision to refrain from joining the Axis. Portugal's leader at the time, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, reached out to the Brits prior to announcing his nation's neutrality and was able to establish an agreement on the fact that, while the Treaty of Windsor would prevent Portugal from joining the Axis party, it did not automatically require the Portuguese to fight alongside the Allies. While the Brits respected this decision and even declared that they did not feel like they would need Portuguese support, they did find a bit of a loophole. Conspiring alongside the Americans, Britain decided that although Portuguese military aid was not a necessity, Allied use of the Azores was. Initially, Salazar opposed this, as he was always in fear of retaliation from Germany or even his next-door neighbor in Spain. The Allies, however, were sure of the fact that the use of the Azores for airfields was crucial, and the Brits insisted that the Treaty of Windsor required Portugal to cooperate on just that. Hesitant but not unwilling, Salazar eventually agreed, but informed Britain that their American allies could not enter the Azores and would be forcibly stopped if they attempted to do so. This would eventually change, but the reason for the immediate denial was due to the fact that the peace treaty could only be used as an excuse, if pressed by the Germans, for the Brits to enter Portugal, not the Americans. Salazar was concerned on a regular basis about a potential invasion from the Axis, which was another reason as to why Portugal didn't join the war on the Allied side. Despite Portugal and Spain being fairly close, the former feared that the latter may align with Germany, and if Portugal made a wrong move, may attack their neighbor on the Axis's behalf. There was also a fear that Germany itself could invade, which put significant pressure on Salazar to remain neutral. Although, it appears that the Portuguese leader decided to be extra careful. Not only did the Portuguese remain out of battle, but they also appealed to the Axis by helping Germany obtain some much-needed materials, like wolfram. This mineral was highly accessible in Portugal, and Salazar knew that he could use this fact and the war itself to his own economic advantage. Even though the Allies were strongly against the sale of this valuable substance to the Axis, Portugal would begin to sell mass amounts of wolfram to Germany, with some reports even stating that up to 75% of its wolfram exports went to the Germans, with only about 25% being sold to the Brits. Still, the Treaty of Windsor came in handy yet again, as Salazar decided to allow Britain to pay with credit, while Germany had to give the money up front for what they wanted. This wasn't too big of a deal for the Germans, whom the Portuguese did allow to build up massive debts and clearing arrangements, but it still showed a slight favor to Britain to offset the drastic difference in export amounts. Eventually, though, the Allies lost patience with Salazar and his business with Germany, so they decided to put added pressure on Portugal in hopes of ending the sale of wolfram to their opponents. Initially, Portugal refused to put an embargo on wolfram sales to Germany, mostly due to the vast economic gain that these deals had brought in, but also out of fear of an incursion from the Axis if they were to obey the Allies. Nevertheless, just before the fateful D-Day invasion, Salazar decided to put a total embargo on both sides to avoid retaliation from either one, if he were to show any bias. The entire debacle consequently showed the Portuguese what a precarious position they were really in, and why neutrality was so important. Remaining neutral was also...
Isto é muito complicado, ser país tão pequeno, ter exército pequeno, ter recursos pequenos, mesmo estando na altura de Salazar, que Portugal não estava na crise que está agora, né? Mas não deixamos de ser país pequeno, ou seja, é muito fodido tu escolheres lado, porque agora nós sabemos, não é, o que aconteceu, mas na altura não se sabia como é que ia acabar. Mas é complicado, portanto acho que foi o melhor que ele fez, foi manter a cena neutra, porque não se sabia para que lado é que isto iria ser. Ver um vídeo do Império Português, e eu já vi vários, mas não me importa ver convosco, se vocês quiserem, que é muito interessante ver a história de Portugal, é do caralho. Vou só ali buscar um chocolatezinho da Prozis, num instante, porque esta merda da Toblerone deu-me vontade de um chocolate. Entretanto, já vou ver também o vídeo, é uma coisa que eu vou começar a fazer mais diariamente, que é reagir, tipo, pá, eu costumo ver de vez em quando os vídeos do Diogo e o do Numeiro, não é? Então o que é que eu vou fazer? Em vez de estar a ver os vídeos, vou fazer a reação de vê-los convosco aqui. Vou começar a fazer as lives mais assim ao final da tarde. Por acaso agora estou a fazer a hora de jantar, ou faço ao final da tarde ou faço a hora de jantar. Portanto, uma coisa também que é importante, vou pedir aí aos meus moderadores para spamarem aí. Eu criei uma página de clipes oficial, portanto vocês podem subscrever e ativar o sininho, porque assim mesmo quando vocês não virem as lives, conseguem ver só as partes mais importantes, ou as partes mais engraçadas, ou as mais bacanas que vocês quiserem. Gosto muito de história, sim senhor, adoro história, mano.
So crucial if Portugal wanted to avoid a...
Vou só buscar, no entanto, entretanto, aliás, aqueles chocolatitos da Prozis, já vem.
Betrayal by their neighbor, as previously mentioned. Back before the Spanish Civil War, where Portugal supported Spain's
Que é essa merda do eu já, meu?
Franco, the two Iberian nations signed a non-aggression treaty known as the Iberian Pact. In 1940, as both nations worked to remain neutral and allied to each other, they signed an updated agreement following the defeat of France to reiterate their shared goals. Even the contemporary British ambassador in Portugal stated that if Portuguese neutrality, instead of being strict, had been more benevolent in Allies' favor, Spain would inevitably have thrown herself body and soul into the arms of Germans. He also went on to state that if this had happened, not only would the entire Iberian Peninsula have fallen into Axis hands,
Ok, vamos para o... já está visto.